to the day. So our second panel is going to continue this conversation in a very sort of holistic way of looking at technology issues. We'll do sort of broad concepts. What are some of the things that political scientists and public policy experts think about, as well as people who have worked more deeply in the technologies themselves and have direct experience with their application to military contingencies, military requirements, and may help us understand a little bit what's not yet in the inventory, but could well become part of the battlefield of the 21st century. Can you hear me? Okay. So I am delighted to present three very unique and different speakers who each bring different perspectives and experience to this topic. So today we're also trying in this panel to get a little bit at things beyond the Defense Department, or how the Defense Department behaves towards and receives from the interagency, from the Office of the President, et cetera. So put these technologies for military purpose in a larger policy perspective of when are there issues between the Defense Department and other functions of government. I thought that would be panel number 2. It was already on panel number 1 in full bloom. So I think that virtually all day long we're going to be talking about the interactions between things that may have started in the defense world but actually have civilian application, civilian utility and value, or reverse, things that remain part of our civil society, our economy, our society at large, and then are adapted for use by the armed forces. So I hope we'll keep our aperture wide and look at these different kinds of interactions and not limit ourselves to just the battlefield, but I hope we will also learn some new things and interesting things about the battlefield requirements of today and tomorrow. So first I'm going to introduce Barry Pavel, who directs the Scowcroft Center, one of the great components of the Atlantic Council that looks at a whole range of security issues. Among his many projects that he's directing is one called The Future of Defense Technologies. So I'm really delighted to bring his wisdom to this conversation. I've asked Barry to talk about, he also worked at the Defense Department in the Office of the Secretary of Defense on strategy, on thinking about the big conceptual world in which national security resides, that is largely military, but not exclusively military. So Barry's going to share some reflections on how do we position technologies, diverse technologies, in our understanding of strategic thinking and strategic concepts. And I've also asked him to help us understand from his own experience which technological issues kind of migrate to they have to be adjudicated by the White House. What of these issues should the president care about versus issues that are within the authority and the jurisdiction and the domain of the armed services themselves? So Barry, I'm really delighted that you made it out to our campus, and I want to welcome you and thank you for participating today. So any of the speakers are going to perhaps speak from the podium and then come back to their chairs for our discussion.
I decided to be lazy because unusually for me as a longtime Defense Department strategic planner, I don't have slides today. So I'll just offer a few thoughts, and thank you so much for inviting me to this, Ellen. Whenever Ellen asks me to do something, I generally do it. I want to start off by saying I'm not a technologist at all. As Ellen said, I'm a longtime sort of DoD strategic planner and NSC strategic planner. But I speak to technologists a lot these days because I know it's increasingly important. I think I'll make 4 initial key points, then dig into a couple of the specific questions that Ellen asked, and then end on a big point that I think is really important and strategic and is actually very timely today, literally this afternoon. So a couple of the initial points. Number one, we're in a new era of history. Future historians will look back and call it something. I think great power competition is a big part of it. It's by far not the only part of it, and I think the second most important factor, or at least another important factor, is that we're really still at the cusp of the beginning of the digital age, And that's going to play out in major waves. And the biotechnologists whom I speak to, for example, say that the wave that's coming, the biotechnology revolution in the 2030s and 40s, is going to make the communications revolution so far look very tame. That it's going to structurally change our society, our definition of being a human being, our economy, and our security. And we'll have significant discussions of values around that also. So that's just one example. So I think, great power competition, yes, got it. It is very important, but there are a number of other factors defining our era. Secondly, technology is no longer this separate issue that we can discuss kind of over here and in a very nice and neat and tidy box. It permeates everything. It's permeating, like even just look at the traditional industries of agriculture, steel, and transportation. I mean, it is permeating and disrupting everything. And most of it is, almost all of it is really good. There's always a risk side of the equation. And so I think a key point is that technology and the tech-driven economy will really likely be where geopolitical contests are decided. They affect geopolitics a lot, and while the military is very important, critical, we still need it, very important. It's a major deal. We need to keep doing, strengthening our efforts, which we'll hear from, in my view, one of the most brilliant people on defense and technology, T.X. Hammes, shortly. But this is going to be decided, this contest is going to be decided on the technology and economic battlefield. Three, so thinking about all that, we're kind of still resetting for this new era. We're still settling in and trying to figure it out. If you think about, nuclear weapons in the 1950s, it took a while for thinkers, hopefully, there'll be some in this room, to lay out the framework, the context, the policies, the foundations. So we're kind of in that period. I don't know how long it's going to last, but we really need a lot of fresh perspective. So that's why I think efforts like this are really important. And so the United States government is still figuring this out, and so they also need some help. I think overall the U.S. is doing okay, largely because of the private sector that's driving so much of this technology. But I think we're quite behind in the partnership part of this equation, the U.S. plus private sector. And so how do we really put that on steroids is an important part of the broader strategic conversation. Fourth, and I'll just kind of offer 4 ways I think government plays in this space, and then I'll hit some of the specifics and then end, as I said. So the 4 categories of how the Biden administration, I think, grapples with technology. 1, technology for defense and intelligence, and we'll talk about that. I think that's, the White House doesn't have a heavy touch on that, I think, but they obviously influence budgets and some of it. 2, technology for making governance more effective and connecting our departments and agencies and getting a handle on data. A long way to go on that, but that's an effort, and I know nothing about that, but I'll just make sure that I mention it. 3, something really important, as I said, technology for driving the innovation base and the economy. Increasingly, the global economy is driven by technology, and that's going to continue. You look at even the capitalization of major U.S. companies. Here in Washington, we think of defense industry and how important and big it is. The entire defense industry capitalization would fit within just what Apple has alone in terms of cash on hand. So just the scale of these new companies, Apple, Google, Amazon Web Services, it's enormous, and that's where a lot of the driving factors are going to come from. And then 4th, ultimately, it's really important now, and it's a new thing, and it's very hard. It's important for government to try to bring all this together, government plus private sector, and exercise it for influence, for protecting U.S. interests, for working with our allies, diplomatically leverage it for the purposes of U.S. power and defending and advancing our interests. And we'll hear more about an initiative from the White House at roughly 2 or 3 o'clock today. I'm happy to talk about that. So on defense, in the Scowcroft Center, our primary assumption has been that this is going to be the golden age. The 2020 should be the golden age of operational concept development, that there's this explosion of technologies in the commercial sector, and the Defense Department needs to pick these up, harness them in new and interesting ways for strengthening deterrence and securing U.S. Success in high-intensity combat operations with very capable adversaries. TX wrote 2 excellent papers for us over the last 2 years, one regarding Europe, one regarding the Asia-Pacific, that offered very specific concrete examples of how to do this. So in my view, DoD should be seeding hundreds of these kinds of efforts that TX did a couple of for us, and I think the military services are doing this to a degree. I think the Joint Staff is doing this to a degree. To my mind, really, really important, in particular for uncrewed systems orchestrated by very advanced command and control. Some would say AI-enabled. I think the new concept is JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. But anyway, the speeds and distances of combat operations heading into the late 2020s, early 2030s are such that we really need to get going on this. I think China's ahead in a couple of these areas. And they're also very cost-effective approaches for allies, as TX has written about quite a bit. If you even just look at what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh last year, which we can talk about, these concepts are out there by countries we would never consider to be advanced, using these kinds of concepts and capabilities. And so we need to really get going to try to catch up, and ideally to continue to build favorable balances of power in the 2 key regions that matter most for the purposes of defense. New defense technologies also, by the way, are looking likely to upend the strategic forces balance heading into the 2030s. That's a pretty big deal for stability and great power competition, and happy to talk about the details of that. So a couple of specifics and then I'll end. How is DoD doing on integrating technology and harnessing it for combat effectiveness and deterrence? I'm not sure doing quite well, but there's a lot of sort of activity now that's going on that hopefully will lead to the right answer. Again, I'm pointing to TX a lot, but I think he's quite thoughtful on that. It's not yet integrated and coherent. To what extent does the White House set technology policy? I think they influence it. They have a difficult time overseeing its effective execution. Over the long run, we're currently in the middle of a bit of a realignment, in some sense, with Commerce and the National Science Foundation getting large pools of funds with not a lot of guidance and direction on strategy and priorities. So I would definitely draw your attention to that if you do care about the ultimate overall geopolitical contest. But a strategy needs to be developed there. And there, the partnership between government and industry is really critical. It's difficult. It's an ongoing conversation. But I think close work needs to really happen in this space. So I'll end by just discussing the ultimate kind of goal of all of this for national security, and that's bringing it all together to protect our way of life, to protect our interests against an increasingly encroaching authoritarian adversary who has made enormous gains over the last 2 decades, but from what I can tell is starting to really falter because we're ultimately seeing Xi Jinping do what all aging authoritarian dictators do. He's trying to control everything, and that is going to be part of, I think, the undoing of the current Chinese political system. But if we want our future economies, our future societies, those of our close allies to be driven by surveillance technologies exported by China, and if we want to give them the keys to our economy, the keys to our society, then we should just keep doing what we're doing, as long as we don't mind when we vote in the UN in a certain way, and China doesn't like it, they're going to turn something off, the way they did to Korea, the way they're doing to Lithuania, what they're doing to Taiwan, and a wide range of other coercive uses of Chinese economic power. Port infrastructure is relevant, 5G is relevant here, et cetera. If, on the other hand, we want to protect our way of life, we like free speech, we like to have open market economies, then we really need to continue ramping up these efforts, which I applaud the Biden administration borrowing on the Trump administration's initial pieces and continuing those. I think those are really, really important. 3 particular pieces: leveling the economic playing field, because there's tens of billions of dollars in subsidies that the Chinese government has given to their tech and other companies. So we need to level the playing field so democracies can compete more fairly at prices that are reasonable. 2, we need to keep Chinese government-dominated technology companies out. It's very simple. And 3, we can and need to continue offering analogous capabilities from democratic companies for across our allies and partners, in particular in third countries. So later today, you'll hear an initiative announced from the White House from the Quad Summit, where among the many initiatives you'll hear announced will be a technology cooperation initiative among India, Australia, US, and Japan on some particularly important technologies. As I said, Xi Jinping is now starting to control and transfer control of Chinese companies to the Chinese Communist Party. There's a little bit of politics going on. There's a little bit of mafia going on. And it's a control effort that I think ultimately is going to, in real time, this year, this fall, create an enormous opportunity for Western companies to go into third countries, because even the Singapores of the world, these third countries don't want an overtly Chinese Communist Party technology company providing their 5G, providing their online platforms, et cetera. So we need to move quickly, and I think speed is underrated in this overall geopolitical contest. So last point, we really need our allies. We really need the EU. We can't do this alone. The EU is a regulatory and norm-building superpower, and if we don't start doing a better job of consulting with our friends and allies, then we're not going to achieve the goals that I've set out. So we really need to fix that, and I think this afternoon you'll see an initial step toward strengthening U.S. coordination with allies.
Thank you, Barry. Well, that was really terrific and really gets us off to a very strong start, not only embedding the technological innovation in a U.S. government priority list that includes defense but is wider than defense, so that's one key takeaway, but also adding this international dimension. I wanted to make sure that we don't think that this is a U.S. story entirely, and so thinking about the adversaries' technological capabilities, are they having the same debates we're having? What are they, in which arenas might they be getting ahead of us? Where do we have the comparative edge, and the importance of allies in maintaining a comparative edge? So today's announcement is fascinating, but it also brings me to our second speaker, and I'm delighted to welcome Paulo Costa for a number of reasons. One is that some of his work is that piece of international cooperation on technological innovation. So I think we should all be asking ourselves, there is this emerging concept of, techno-nationalism, of how much should technology be guarded within sovereign nation states, and how much of technology automatically spills over borders, and therefore you have to think about the governance of technology in very different ways. Is it global? Is it transnational? How much can sovereign states sort of manage and control technologies that they hold most dear? So I think that some of Paulo's work on international cooperation will be of great interest to us. But equally importantly, we sitting in the Schar School of Policy and Government in Arlington don't often get to collaborate with the rather exciting research components of George Mason University that are out in Fairfax. And one of them is the School of Engineering and Computing, and Paulo runs a Center of Excellence on C4I plus cyber, or C5I, whichever jargon you prefer to use, but very innovative work on starting at information technology, I believe, and expanding it to applications for decision makers, both in military and non-military contingencies. So I'm thrilled to welcome a partner colleague from another part of the university. In addition to this remarkable science background, Paulo Costa is a former fighter pilot from the Brazilian Air Force. So that will bring, and so you can tell us your Top Gun stories if you'd like, to illustrate any points you want to make. So we're delighted to have you, and I think you're going to show us some slides.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't talk Top Gun stories, because then you can't stop me. Okay. Thank you very much, Ellen, for this invitation. I'm really excited to be here with these colleagues from SCAR School, and also in such an exciting topic. So first of all, what is a C4I in cyber? Basically, it's a long, we just put together a number of acronyms in buzzwords, and basically means using technology to help us or get organized in complex operations. I think that would be a good way of summarizing it. So the C4I in Cyber Center basically is the oldest, one of the oldest centers in the engineering school. I think is the oldest center. It started in the 80s. And basically the idea when it started was a guy called Harry Van Tries. He was a chief scientist for DoD, and he retired with the idea that we were not doing a good job in linking people from DoD with industry, with academia. Each one would be talking differently about the same things. So he wanted to establish a place, and he found that going to academia would be easier to do that, where it would work as a hub to aggregate these different views and produce interesting work. And that's what we try to do until today. So what you see in the slides, we're not going to read it, but basically are the main tenets that we try to achieve. I would emphasize the last one, which I was mentioning here, which is the bridge the cultural gaps. When I say cultural, it's really about that. It's really about how you perceive things. Although we have the same goals, sometimes we use different, I wouldn't say even different acronyms for the same word, but also we see how technology is applied from a different perspective. So usually the way the center works is when we have a project, we try to tap into the department or the researchers that have a closer understanding or have been working in the subject. So that basically put us in a situation where we do a lot of different stuff. So everything that you see there, sensor infusion, command support, etc., is part of the mix. And that somewhat explains the diversity that we have in terms of projects there. And of course, with such a large spectrum of technologies, we have also a large spectrum of sponsors. And you see the usual suspects here, DoD, DOE, DOT, major contractors, etc. So we've been working with all of them in technology solutions. I can't, of course, go through all these projects that we have currently. So I just cherry-picked a few, 4 of them, based on the questions that Ellen asked me and the point that she asked me to emphasize. So the first one that I would like to emphasize is StarTides. It's basically a good example where you have the center acting as a hub in terms of with different communities. So there's no military specific thing going on here. So if you look closely, what was happening is we are emphasizing resilience in the community. So if a disaster happens, is that community prepared? How can we put a lot of effort into a short amount of time and still be able to organize the community? And of course, when you say about this, there's the technological component. So we talk about connectivity, all the radios, all the support that we have to reach there, having a backup for internet and everything when a disaster happens, but also, and I think it's more important than that, is having the community itself aware of what happens in a situation like this. When chaos comes, it's not time to teach. So we have to do that earlier. And that's the main goal, I believe, of StarTides. And I think it's a good example of where we apply C4I technology into the civilian mode that provides a better place to everyone involved here. The other project that I'm emphasizing here is a battle management language, and I'm happy that our first panelist here mentioned the need that we have to reach out to our allies. And this is actually a NATO effort. And the idea is to reinforce the standards that we have for our military to communicate. BML is actually a language that was developed in the C4I Center I believe in the early 90s and is still in use today. But the idea was to be able to formalize command intent in different levels in a way that computers can understand. Of course, it's kind of an analogy here, but the computers can understand means we have a way of formalizing the way we communicate to a computer what each level of command wants. And then we use that in simulations that we can apply to any different situation. So this is an effort that is still going on until today and has been providing us with a lot of insights that are very interesting in also seeing how our allies are looking at those very same problems. And so I would say it's one good example of how technology can help us understand what our allies are doing, how they work, and what are their priorities, and so on. So that's basically what we have there. The other two, and that's, I think, my last slide, are the two projects that are more related to the government. So the first one is the is within the DARPA ACK program. And what DARPA wants from us is really automate the process of not only planning the warfare, but also reacting to changes. When you have a new situation, a target of opportunity, or something that the enemy did, because the plan will be destroyed at the first contact with the enemy. But the planning process is where you learn a lot, and if you're prepared for that, it makes your life easier when you have to readapt your plan. In this case, what DARPA wants from us is to react not in hours, but in seconds, which is a tall order. Basically, what this specific project is about is to build automatically what we call kill chain. So if you have a target, there's a large number of possibilities that I can destroy or interdict, depending on what I want to do with that target, with all the assets that we have around, from the Navy, from the Air Force, Marines, etc., space, cyber. So putting this multi-domain set of assets that we have in the environment towards the optimization of our goals is really what the ACK program is about. Arachnid is actually one of the things that I learned as a professor is that if you come up with a fancy, sexy acronym, you have more chances. So I don't really remember what Arachnid stands for, but it's an acronym. And it worked that we're doing it. So that's interesting. But why I picked this one? Because it involves a number of questions that Alan asked me. For example, what technologies that we use that can be developed in conjunction with our allies? Or even more than that, what are the technologies that can have a dual use? And you see in this project, I think I have actually a slide after that, that we use open source software, and we also use software that was developed in another country. I think the key thing here is not the technology itself, but how you use it, and being able to separate what is really important in terms of information dominance. So to make it a little bit clear, let me step aside and mention one experience that I also have in a number of projects. Usually, what makes our life more difficult is when someone comes and say, oh, I don't want any foreign national, any collaboration because this is very important secret. When we have here in the US, one of the things that differentiate us is the strength of our research infrastructure. I mean, we have the best universities by far. We have numbers, we have companies, we have a lot of untapped, I think it's untapped. We do not utilize all the potential that we can utilize in DoD applications, in defense applications, because of that misunderstanding between not allowing foreign, I would say foreign, but not only foreign, even West persons that do not have clearance. So trying to generalize it and avoiding that collaboration hurt us in a number of things, and I've been seeing this a lot. So all the universities that we have rely on foreign individuals who are doing their masters, their PhDs, and we can use them. We can use their brain power to help us develop things. And both projects that you see there have this component that, in my view, are not as well leveraged as it could be. So the second one is not really a project, it's an institute. It's an institute in Texas. The CyMany Cyber Security Manufacturing Innovation Institute is a DOE project. It's very recent. The CyMany Institute was created in this year. We're basically having 1 year. It involves, this is actually outdated. We already have 26 DD universities. We have the best of them, which is Mason. But we also have our California Vine, UT System, Carnegie Mellon, and a number of boutique universities, and also strong universities that we have across the country helping on this. We also have 3 national labs, Idaho, Sandia, in Oak Ridge as well, in a number of industry partners. So what is this about? Basically, the idea is that we are in a situation now that the digital transformation is here to stay. And a lot of our manufacturing infrastructure is still not leveraging all that it could in terms of IT, computing resources for fear of being attacked. And that fear is justifiable. I mean, if you look, for example, at this aluminum engine block production, this is the DOE, so they care about energy consumption. But if you see energy consumption, improving energy consumption as improving our processes, then it's a broader interest. So machining alone, you see 7.5 million kilowatts per year is used in energy. If we were able to digitalize this, and these are conservative figures, we would be able to save, just in optimizing the paths that you see in the manufacturing process, 0.75 kilowatts per year we could save. We could also save 1.875 kilowatts per year if we were able to minimize vibration, which we can do with the controllers that are interconnected and have more advanced technologies embedded. So why we don't do that? Again, fear of being attacked. So if you look at the pie chart at the top, that's energy consumption, which means 27% of all the energy being spent in the United States is due to manufacturing. However, in terms of attacks, we have a 35%. That means it's a large target. And if you imagine that if you have an attack in a furnace, it will take days just for the physical part to be restarted, and if it can. So it's a lot of money involved in having the courage to make all these processes more vulnerable by digitalizing. Takes a while. So CyMany is what DoD thinks the solution is, and I agree with them. So basically is implementing those technologies in a much more controlled way that is secure. And security here doesn't mean the idea of a castle with walls. It's the other way around. You assume that you can be attacked and that you can be, at some point, you will be compromised. So how resilient you are, how good you are in determining that you were attacked, and how much damage can be done. So there's a number of technologies that we've been using in this project, all the buzzwords that you have been hearing, digital twins, blockchain, etc. Again, the point here is not the technology, it's how you use it. And that's why it's so important for us being able to tap on dual-use technologies, on open source software, and things that are not secret are there. We can use it. However, the way you structure the command and control infrastructure for this is what makes the difference. And I think we are still way miles ahead of our competitors on this. It's just that they are closing in and we have to react. We can't afford things such as what happened with 5G, that we didn't invest enough. And now we see ourselves as behind the, not only China, but other countries as well. And another good example, this is the software that we are using in the Arachnid, in the DARPA ACK. It's a software produced in another country. I mean, actually many countries, it's an open source. So it is a, I don't want to get into the details of what this thing does, but it's very complex. So I'm not surprised to see that we have third world countries and others that we thought were not as advanced, doing advanced things. Because if you look in the internet, you find those things. You find very complex software available. And this is what we've been using so far. Just to give you a background, this is about explainable AI. And that tackles, I think, the last point that Ellen asked me to emphasize, which is how we improve the way commanders and decision makers use technology. And one of the main problems with decision support is that you cannot really rely fully on a computer. You have to understand what's going on and then use your own experience to assess whether that makes sense or not. You have to exercise judgment. And a lot of time that I talk about this specific project in universities and other places, they ask me, oh, why don't you simply do a deep learner and technology that are black boxes? And I say, yeah, we use, but not in that situation. When I need to provide an explanation, it's better that and provide an explanation is not doing just the fancy drawings that you see here. It's to understand how the paths for the decision occurred, what are the key aspects in each path, how can I improve? Oh, I need more information here. How much that information costs? Should I divert a satellite? Should I invest on more sensors? And then once I have this, I can act. And so I think the key part here is that it's an important, complex topic that we've been working with, using software that is available openly. But no matter if any of our enemies have access to the same softwares, they can't reproduce the things we are doing. And I think that's the key part of being able to separate what really matters in terms of technology use. And it's not the technology per se, it's not the algorithms that are there, they are open. It's really being able to do this whole command and control infrastructure where each piece glues together in a synergistic way. Anyways, if I keep talking, I will just go and I'm not even start to do the fighter pilot thing. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions there. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you. No, that was really terrific. And I like the complementarity of technology for the decision maker versus technology for the actual, kinetic situation. So you need both. That certainly are issues that were debated a lot in the nuclear age of whether command and control issues. So the combination of the performance of weapons that have a lot of technology embedded in them, but equally the technology that supports the decision maker who may not be the person on the battlefield, but the person who has to make some very hard choices. So our next speaker is a very big voice, big man around town, very famous person on defense issues, and I'm really delighted that he could join us. T.X. Hammes is now at the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies, INSS. 30 years in the Marines, and I think has some really interesting and perhaps provocative views on different kinds of technologies, the sort of full spectrum of technologies, and which ones should we focus on more than others. So I welcome you and look forward to your comments.
First, I'd like to thank the Center and Ellen in particular for the invitation. It's been an interesting morning already. I've learned quite a number of things. You'll notice I've got slides. There's going to be lots of pictures because I'm a Marine and we like pictures. It makes it easier for us. What I'm going to talk about is this major change in a return to defense dominance. Through history, there are periods where defensive systems dominate over offensive systems. In the feudal age, a castle could stand against anything you could do for years. In between the middle of the US Civil War and the end of World War I, you see a defense dominance where if you're out above the surface of the earth out to about 7 kilometers, you're dead. And so you had to change. Then we get after World War I with the advent of armor, we begin to move to offense dominance. And the US Armed Forces are built for offense dominance, everything from our psychology to our weapon systems. And so it's going to be a major shock that we have to return to defense dominance. Why do I say that? Well, 2 things are all I've got time to talk about today. One is pervasive surveillance, and the other is the advent of large numbers of autonomous long-range precision systems. Oops. So pervasive surveillance, these are the systems that are in space today that mean 24 hours a day, you can see virtually the entire planet in visual, infrared, synthetic aperture, and now also in electromagnetic spectrum, which means if you are moving on the surface of the planet Earth, I can know about it with the accuracy sufficient to target you. Also, cyber and social media is a continuous surveillance and finds ways to find you even when you're hiding from everything else. So essentially, the only way you can hide now is either blend in, you play Where's Waldo, or you have to have overhead cover. Well, what does that lead to? Well, when I say long-range precision attack, we tend to think long range is our fighter aircraft, but this is the problem. We are investing huge amounts of money in the F-35 program, and someday it might actually work. But in the meantime, all of these systems, and this is a very small sample of the global systems that outrange it. And the single greatest thing in history that makes you obsolete is range. Any armored knight could kill any peasant with a crossbow if he could just get close enough. But the little buggers insisted on killing him first. Any battleship could defeat any carrier if it can get within range. They never can. So keep that in mind as we look through this. That's the primary problem. At the high end, there are some simple systems that are out there now. The Execute-58A is a vertical takeoff and landing jet. And the reason that's vitally important is no airfield to destroy. If I have long-range precision and persistent surveillance, I can find your airfield. I will know how many aircraft are there. And while this thing, the F-35, may be really hard to kill in the air, it's just a big fat target on the ground. The Execute-58A is vertical takeoff and landing, which means it can launch from almost anywhere and land somewhere else. And at only $2 million a pop, it's 1/50th the cost of an F-35. The Harap is a loitering munition in the Nagorno-Karabakh fight. It was very important. It goes up, it flies to an area, it orbits, and then it actively hunts autonomously, matching visual, infrared, and electromagnetic signatures in order to hunt and kill. It's operational in 10 nations, and oh, by the way, it outranges the F-35. And it launches off a truck like that, so you can't find it. The last one is something the Marine Corps is experimenting with, and I think the Air Force is joining us. The C-130 launching a TUV-AS. It's simply a drone, an autonomous drone that comes out of the back, but it can fly 1,400 miles. So when you add the C-130 range of 2,200 miles, 1,400, 3,600 miles, finally you're getting in standoffs. Only a very few missiles in the world can range this system. 1 meter circular probable with a 250-pound warhead. On a simpler note, you look at these are all ground-based systems. Look at the ranges you're getting there, and these are out there and fairly cheap. But the most important thing is you'll notice they all seem to be launched from boxes. Well, if you take the boxes off the very distinct military vehicles and do this to hide in plain sight, if you're a targeteer and you're looking out there and you see a 20-foot container that looks like that and it's closed, you're not wasting ordnance on it. Even if you decide to kill the 20-foot containers, you cannot kill all the 20-foot containers in the target area. The ship below is just a small merchant ship that they literally strapped a truck on top of it to launch that missile. The Chinese have 7,500 ocean-going ships. Each one of those is a potential missile carrier. So we have got to rethink what we're doing, and this is where the big problem is going to be. In trade-offs, the F-35 with lifetime cost, because it costs so much to operate per operating hour, you could have 300 Kratoses or 1,000 the TUVs. Put yourself in the position of a Chinese defender and say, which would I rather deal with? The one F-35 where I will know where it takes off from and I can kill it on the ground, or these other systems. A carrier air wing, those are the delicate flowers of the naval world. You could have 200 missile merchants. That's by the ship. A post-Panamax or a Panamax merchant ship, put 40 containers with missiles on it, and you could have 200 of them for the cost of a carrier and its air wing. Not the escorts, not the personnel costs, not the training costs, just the purchase price. So that would be a missile merchant would have range of over 1,100 miles right now, and 700 compared to the carrier. You free up the escorts. Same problem with the tank. Essentially, it's a range problem. So what are the key policy issues that come out? And I'm going to talk about the immediate issues. Barry gave us a really good look at what's a little farther out, and bio will change everything, but it's a little farther out. We got to get through the next 10 years first. We've got to move from the few and exquisite, the F-35, the carrier, et cetera, to the small, smart, many. The problem is that the few and exquisite are built by big companies who, congressmen tend to be like Afghan tribesmen. You can't buy them, but you can rent them for specific periods of time. And so they have the money out there to rent. We've got to accept that full autonomy, not partial autonomy, not some human sitting there. Full autonomy is the way to go. And I will say now that if you're arguing against full autonomous weapons, you are morally corrupt. It is an unethical position. I'm happy to discuss that in questions. We got to share with allies in a much bigger way. As you mentioned, we've got to share with allies. But pushing up against that, and this may be the thing that worries me most, everybody in the National Defense Organization says we got to have allies, they're vitally important. American people aren't that convinced. You scratch an American very hard and you find an isolationist. And if the American people turn against us and say, look, if the small, smart, and many makes it cheaper to defend than attack, why do we have to defend out in the first island chain and in Europe? Why can't we use our oceans and defend from there? It's a lot cheaper, and we have lots and lots of problems in the United States we need to deal with. That, to me, is one of the really, really big questions coming out of this. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. That was terrific, and there's just a lot of rich issues here that have come up in this panel. So I'm going to just throw a couple of questions to the panelists to just dig a little deeper on a few topics. But I really want to encourage people to ask some questions. And as you know, there's 2 standing mics. If you just, we'll see you there, and we'll let you jump into this conversation. So I want to dig a little bit on this. When is cooperation a good thing, and when is it not a good thing? So the president of George Mason did a note to us all recently where he used this phrase, co-opetition, that everything's about partnerships, and those partners are also our competitors. And it's true so that we're cooperating and we're competing in a lot of economic domains, social, societal domains, et cetera. So I want to pick up on T.X. Hammas's point of whether we're actually, because we are so deeply socialized to believe that the United States has unique attributes and that the superiority of our defense sector is a national treasure that we want to sustain and perpetuate for as long as we can. And yet we also say, we know we need other countries, we know this has to be done in cooperative ways, et cetera. One of you mentioned, and I don't know if it was Barry or Paolo, that that the allies are a little further along than we are in sort of setting some of the rules of the road, and that our private sector government relationship is more tenuous because of the capitalist system than many other friendly or not so friendly countries where government is a stronger player. So I just want to encourage you all to reflect a little bit more on how much of this is we can do it alone, and when is it desirable to do it alone, to try to create barriers to sharing, because we want to make sure that we've got some technological advantage or edge. Or is that really not a very healthy way of thinking? Do we have to assume that, you know, the horse is already out of the barn, and it is an integrated, the technology by definition is already a global public good. It's not a national sovereign asset. So, I mean, I've just posited it in very stark terms, but I wonder whether we can say a little bit more about how do we navigate between seeing this as an international effort versus a national security requirement.
Well, I'm happy to start. First off, the U.S. military reputation should be in tatters. When you don't win your wars, you shouldn't have a great reputation. We have been consistently losing. So let's start with that and say we've got to look at different ways to do it. Cooperative, I think this announcement of the Quad is a really great thing, because all of these new weapon systems are at technology level that India, Australia, Japan, Korea, Singapore, US could all cooperate on. And then they're inexpensive enough we could provide them to nations like the Philippines. And you don't ask for an alliance, because that's really hard to do, but you say, look, you want an ability to hold the Chinese at arm's distance. These missiles will let you. They're cheap enough, we put them in boxes, they're easy to maintain, and you can use them. So I think that's very, very important. And the other thing to remember is the tech is coming from the civilian world. One of the problems, we've had this odd fantasy that from about 1940 to about 1989, the technologies that were advanced came out of DoD. But previous to that in history, and since then, it's all come out of the civilian world. All the great advances that set us up to win in World War II, most of them came out of the civilian world. And what we're seeing now is all of those technologies that gave us precision weapons, came out of DoD, are now being done better in the civilian world. Synthetic aperture radar, small enough to put on a satellite because we wanted self-driving cars. And that's what's driving it. So we've got to accept that, reach out to the people around the world. And the other huge problem is our immigration policy is suicidal. What we're doing to block students and people with STEMs from staying in the United States is absolutely insane. And it's going to hurt us. And the Canadians are taking advantage of it. I don't know if you see what they're building. They're building Silicon Valley in Toronto. And what they're doing is they're coming down here and coming to people with STEM degrees and going, you know, you got a STEM degree and you know the United States isn't going to let you stay. But if you'll come to Canada, we'll guarantee you a path to citizenship and help you move. Yeah, you got to live in Toronto when it's cold, but at least you get to stay.
Yeah, I would like to, emphasize, it's a wonderful point. I saw this in person. Just before COVID, I went to Toronto to do a talk on Simony. And it was packed because they forced the students to go there and see us. It's not because I was like, but after there and talking to many of them, I saw this in person. I saw people who actually either wanted to go to US or were in the US previous to that and then move it to Canada. And they are doing now research there in producing new things that could have been occurring here in the US. So I think, this, and I've been seeing this over and over in many situations. Of course, it's not just open to everybody, but being smart on how to retain knowledge. A lot of countries would love to have that, avoid the brain drain. In our case, it seems that we are promoting brain drain by simply putting people outside, those that we want to stay. We have, a problem that we have in engineering is that our graduates, they get hired, even in the third year, because there is a huge demand. And if the graduate is a US citizen, you simply can't hold the person because he will have a 3 times better pay in outside academia or anything. So the point here is when we see that it's so difficult to get the technologies that we develop being used or being further developed because we don't have the ability to hold our brains, let's put that way, it really speaks out to what Jax was mentioning here. And I'm happy that you mentioned this. It's something that I see basically every day happening there.
I thought one of the other syndromes is that, in part because of Trump era, the Muslim ban, et cetera, that people are even not coming here necessarily for their grad school. They may be going to Australia or Canada or Europe so that we didn't even produce. In the past, we've produced and then we've allowed them to sort of disperse instead of give them reasons to stay. And I think we're even bringing in fewer of the talent.
Yeah, we're collapsing STEM programs all over the country because I went for my doctoral into Europe, so I paid 5 times what a British student paid. That's what they're paying here. They pay much, much more. And then 40 to 70% of most STEM programs are foreign students. Well, when they leave, your STEM program collapses.
40 to what percent?
40 to 70% of most university STEM programs are, and people have been tracking this, and STEM programs are collapsing all over the country. And where they're benefiting is Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand. They've all said, if you're going to get STEM, you really want it in English, because that's the business, that's the language. So get it in English. And if the Americans are going to be nasty about it, and you come here, you spend a year, and then you can't renew your visa, you've wasted a year, because it's not that transferable. So don't even come.
I think you'll hear just a couple follow-ups to your first question, but on STEM in particular, this is going to be released publicly later, but if everything goes well, I think there's going to be an international student STEM part of the initiatives that are announced at the Quad Summit at 2 o'clock. So very, very important for integrating our societies and all the reasons that we just heard. On my own reaction on your question of whether we really need allies, if you think about hypersonic missiles, for example, and how to defend against them at those speeds, I think 7 times the speed of sound or something like that, you're going to need capabilities to detect and defend against them in more than one country to be able to triangulate and be able to handle it. So you actually literally will need allies if you're trying to defend against hypersonic missiles, depending on where they're targeted. If you think about AI, which runs on data, and the stronger your data, the more organized your data, what the technologists tell me, the better your AI will be. China has 1.1 billion people to be harnessing that kind of data. US has 330 million people. Europe has another significant chunk of people. So if the US and Europe and Japan and our allies are together and work together closely, then we can have the same capability of AI as China. So that's I'm just giving you those particular examples. U.S. has amazing technology and capability, in particular in defense industry, and it is probably the best in the world overall, and at the scale. But there are allies and partners, even some non-allies, who provide some exquisite leading technologies that the U.S. doesn't have. And by the way, this includes France in certain areas.
I do want to get to submarines in a minute, but Will, you want to come up and introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks again for a fascinating discussion. My name's Will. I'm currently a master's student at GMU. I have 2 classes with Professor Leibson. And I was wondering if we could maybe just talk about the implications of the points that you brought up. I know, for example, that I think the Marine Corps has come out with a recent plan that's generated a lot of controversy because they're, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're cutting all of their tanks. So it seems like they might be kind of taking the implications of this head on. But I wonder, for example, a service like the Navy, whose image, going all the way back to World War II is essentially predicated on, the carriers. Are they in kind of a similar situation where, like, say, maybe, the US Navy is the version of the Royal Navy before World War II, where they built everything around battleships, and then that turned out to be very, very wrong? Or are we in a different situation?
I think it's a similar situation, but it's much worse. We're beginning to see some of the Navy leadership get the message. A couple of years ago, they said they weren't going to refuel the Harry S. Truman. And Congress said, what, are you stupid? Of course you're refueling it. Because there are 6 senators, Virginia, Washington, California, where the carriers are home ported, and you are going to have them vote against it. So this powerful political bloc, which is consciously built by the people who build ships and airplanes. The B-1 got canceled twice, and then it got enough congressional districts, you couldn't cancel it. So every other airplane since then has been built in over 300 congressional districts. It's just a plan. First role of all major weapon systems is to penetrate Congress. If you can solve that, you can get your weapon system built. So that's the problem. The thinkers in the Navy are here. When I first started pitching this 7, 8 years ago, I got a lot of pushback. Now I'm generally getting agreement, except for those who still think they have a chance to make a flight. Because you can't stand up in Navy aviation now and say, you know, carriers, not such a good idea. You're not going to make it. The Marine Corps has jumped that way. This Commandant has jumped the Marine Corps really hard. And I think it's all the right direction. Tanks aren't of much value in this type of environment.
If I could just add on to that, just my own personal experience running the, believe it or not, the 2001 Defense Strategy Review. We were arguing with the Navy leadership in that review about the vulnerability of aircraft carriers to Chinese missiles, which were going to be built and produced in larger quantities and at longer ranges than they were saying. 20 years. We've been talking about the vulnerability of aircraft carriers and how we need new operational concepts, harnessing new technologies to be able to make sure that we can do what we need to do. And in particular, in the Indo-Pacific operating environment, or at least the planned operating environment, it's even a clearer case that anything, you know, China has an enormous amount of capability that they can bring to bear very rapidly on timelines of their choosing across, for example, the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea. And we have a long way to get there. So it's just, you know, there may be other contingencies that surprise us. We're very good at being surprised by contingencies, but for most of the ones that people are planning for deterring China, this is ultimately about deterrence. And for deterring Russia, I think everything that TX has been saying makes a ton of sense and is cost effective.
Thank you.
If we get this quad on that data thing, it's 1.1 billion Indians, 120 million Chinese or Japanese, 300 million of us, 300 million Europeans. We can way out data the Chinese.
Yeah, and just a quick clarification. So the initiatives that will be announced this afternoon are not defense. They are all in the enormously underappreciated elements of American power that are non-defense. And so I think you're going to see a lot more of that. It ultimately strengthens our security enormously. So it's not, you know, defense, but it's really important for protecting us, as I said, technology and economy.
I was thinking earlier of your comments that it's really quite a nice example of, you know, soft power adding up to hard power as smart power. You know, that it really is an integration of different national attributes for a strategic objective, but one that can be done as much on the civilian side as on the military side. But it does tempt me to ask about this episode with the subs and France, because at least one piece of that was technology, of whether the French were selling an expensive package that had older technology, or some, you know, protocol about non-nuclear powered submarines. So I wonder if you want to speak to, you know, there's the political aspects of it, there's the cultural aspects of it, there's many dimensions to the story, but one of them was that, you know, the Australians lost interest in a major procurement because they thought the technology was obsolete, right? So did the French not understand that, or is there such competition that you can be that far along in a major procurement transaction, and then the technology causes the transaction to, you know, to collapse?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem the Australians have is operationally, nuke subs are what you need in the Pacific. It's just too big for a conventional sub. Even an area-independent propulsion has to refuel too often.
But they didn't think that a few years ago when they signed a contract with
No, because they weren't looking at, they were thinking in terms of defending immediate Australia. Now they're looking at China as a bigger threat, and how do I deal with that? So that's a different problem. The other thing is, it had not gotten far enough along that the political interests in Australia investing in this were big enough to stop it. For instance, we are starting our 5th rework of the F-35, but this time Lockheed assures us, you know, give us another couple $1 billion. This time we guarantee it's going to work. And we're jumping on that deal.
So that also, though, just to be very clear, the program was not going well at all. So even for the less advantageous capability that it was going to provide, it was in trouble. It was in such trouble that President Macron went to Australia to say, don't worry, we're going to set this right a couple of years ago.
So it was a problem in their industry that they were...
So the French, from what I'm told, I'm not an expert in French submarine technology, but those who I speak to pretty often over the last week or so say It was not good. It was they beat the Japanese, I guess, in the initial tender, but it was not going well. And with the strategic, the operational issues that TX raised, it seemed like, and the Australians were the initiators of this new approach. My own view, politically, it was extraordinarily damaging to not consult with the French, except for what might have been like a few hours before the public announcement, because as I said at the end of my remarks, we need France, we need the EU, and with Merkel leaving the scene, guess which country is going to drive the European Union for the foreseeable future? It's France, and we need to be really close to the French on technology, on economy, on these very things that we're talking about, so we can stay together. Because China and Russia will look to exploit any divisions. Any week now, if we're not careful, we're going to see that come out as a China-France initiative or a China-EU initiative. We really need to quickly recover, and there's lots of options to have joint initiatives with the French on certain defense technologies where they are very good, on broader commercial economic issues. I just think it's really easy to do. And so I think it was a major stumble, but ultimately recoverable, because I think the French still do think that we share our share values as democracies and open market.
And I think the two presidents did finally talk yesterday.
They did finally speak. The French are going to extract a price. They should, but I think we'll come back together.
But it raises just to move a little bit beyond the technology-specific topic to the broader geopolitics that Barry presented early on. It raises an interesting question of whether we think of the China threat as an Asia-Pacific issue or whether we think of it as a global issue, and how much do the Europeans really want to play in Asia, or is it because there's equally a concern about China's ability to project power globally, and not just in its, I think that our own understanding of China's ambitions and China's potential keeps changing, is evolving. But it is interesting to me that the Quad, when you think about it, is we have bifurcated the world. There's the Europe problem, and then there's the Asia problem, and we only reached out to Asian partners in the Quad, and yet the Europeans keep saying, what about us? What about us? We have presence in the Asia Pacific. We have history there. We have sort of different assets than you do, and we want to be part of it.
The problem, of course, is range. I mean, yes, the British wanted to come, and yes, they brought their carrier. They had to borrow half their airplanes from us, and they can only stay a little while. And the French sent a couple of frigates. And so this is a problem from an operational range and scale is a problem, a range and scale. I think on the soft power side is where we can really take advantage of this. This is where the great capability would come from. I think we need to move away from thinking of military aspects of Europeans coming out and focus on how do we cooperate on soft power. And rather than cooperating so much with the defense industry, let's look at the AI. Let's look at the things like that, so that we are bringing that to bear. So it's their 300 million and our 300 million on one team. I mean, their 300 million being EU.
Yeah, I agree with that. The other point, and so, even like 5 years ago, this town thought of China as an Indo-Pacific problem. And I still encounter, even in draft documents that some of my people want to get out, I see a section in a strategy paper that says China and the China/Indo-Pacific. No, China is a global power right now. They are the #1 trading partner of a lot of countries, including in Europe. Their military power, I try to look ahead, and I call it, people call it foresight. I call it informed speculation. Look ahead at the trends we're seeing where Chinese are starting to build bases in Africa, getting port access along the Mediterranean. They're coming. They are coming to EUCOM militarily eventually. So NATO's right now developing its strategic concept. How they handle China will be very important. I think it's the most important area to discuss because these strategic concepts only get written about once every 10 years. So we have to use some projections to see where China will be militarily. But even if not, NATO, for example, is a political military also consultation organization. So how does NATO and the EU and North America, including the Canadians, get together and think about China's attempts to buy things, to influence societies, to use information operations, to use intelligence operations in European homelands and in our own homelands. I think that those sort of non-kinetic, soft power stuff is really the growth game where we need to get together and come to agreement across the different domains: information, cyber, technology, economics, investment, port infrastructure, all that stuff. We need to get together on that.
Paulo, I wonder if I could invite you to put on your Brazilian hat to represent a different geography that hasn't been well represented here. In terms of China threat, the Brazilian armed forces, to what extent is what we're describing here equally relevant?
Yeah. I was going to say, I was actually going to comment on this because I'm pretty sure it's a global threat, not because of the kinetic aspects only. I mean, we can imagine that the kinetic aspects are constrained to that region. But when we see what happened in technology, what is happening today, all the Huawei issue, for example, they still dominate. And when you see, I mean, I've been outside the Brazil environment for a while, but from the little I've been following, I can see that even the military there are concerned with the vulnerability that they have with respect to the Chinese equipment. I mean, there's a lot of acquisitions because the Chinese sold their equipment, and most of the infrastructure in South America, it's not only Brazil, is based on Chinese equipment. Same thing is happening in Africa. And so when we see all that infrastructure being dependent on Chinese products, we can have a grasp of how difficult it is to counteract these. We're way behind. And again, I know I've been in the same point here, but we're still ahead in a number of technological areas. But we're getting way behind in telecommunications, 5G. We still can get there. But if we keep doing the same STEM policy that we've been doing the last years, we have simply no way to recover. So I think that's one of our key threats.
I think one of the other interesting things, if you look at trade patterns, we're seeing a period of deglobalization, of regionalization of trade. We're seeing an Asia trade bloc, a Europe trade bloc, and a North America with some South America, not as much as we should. That's going to reinforce this American attitude of why are we out in the world? I think we've got to be aware of that, but we also should be working to strengthen that, particularly in this hemisphere, because China's clearly going to dominate the Asian market just because of proximity and size and the willingness to throw money at the problem. So we, as it is developing and we're aware of it, we're seeing manufacturing return to the United States, not as fast as it should be because of some of our policies. Services are returning to the United States because that's what the fourth industrial revolution does for you. You can do local manufacturing. With advanced manufacturing, labor is no longer an issue. Intellectual property rights, shipping distances, insurance, all those sorts of things become an issue.
And the economics department of this university should debate that a little bit further because I do think there are some downsides to thinking that labor is, the least critical factor. I mean, I do think that
Cost of labor.
Cost of labor.
Not quality of labor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, high productivity, but also the way technology doesn't need as many human beings to produce what we need to produce. So lots of, that's a different debate. But I think we've had a wonderful conversation with some very strong, concrete examples of how different technologies generate different kinds of problems and challenges for the policy world. I really welcome the ability to think about this in geopolitical terms as well. We're about to take a break.